Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Just a warning, there is graphic information covered in this episode. Episode 152, Sergeant Griffin. Part 1. Thomas John Augustus Griffin was a senior Queensland police officer who was executed in June 1868 after being found guilty of the double murder of two police officers, Troopers John Power and Patrick Cahill, who were on duty and under Griffin's protection and authority. So what led to Thomas Griffin being in such a prominent position in society? What drove him to murder? Thomas Griffin was born on the 27th of July 1832 at Bainbridge in County Down, which is now modern Northern Ireland. He was raised in County Sligo in the northwest of Ireland. He was the son of John Loftus Griffin and Anne Thompson. Griffin's father was a county inspector of police. Another version of Griffin's origins states that he was the illegitimate son of an English officer in Dublin, and his mother was a lady's maid or some superior servant, and that he received his early education at a Dublin model school. As a young man, Griffin was described as wild and flighty. He was considered to be good-natured, but exceedingly vain, boastful, and given to white lies. In a speech that he made from the dock at his trial, he claimed to be of good birth and highly connected, and he joined the constabulary at the age of 17 and acted as a clerk in the office of his father, the police inspector. When the Crimean War broke out, he volunteered for service and acquired a reputation for determination and valour in the field. After his father's death, the family suffered from reduced circumstances in consequence of a lawsuit between the family and an uncle of his. So, in late 1853, he was assigned initially as an assistant storekeeper in the commissariat department, where he won 2 decorations. In 1855, he joined the Turkish contingent and he held a commission as a cornet. The Turkish contingent, also known as the Anglo-Turkish contingent, was a detachment of the Turkish Army infantry, artillery and cavalry regiments, and it was placed under the command of commissioned British officers. Griffin later advanced to the rank of adjutant, and by the end of his service was awarded 2 Turkish and Crimean medals. When his service in Crimea was finished, Griffin accepted an offer of free travel to Australia made available to police volunteers who had served in the war. Griffin departed Liverpool in early December 1856 aboard the ship the Champion of the Seas that was arriving in Melbourne in early March 1857. During the voyage to Australia, the 24-year-old Griffin became acquainted with Harriet Clisser, a widow, aged 42 years. Mrs. Clisser was travelling with her 2 adult sons, William and George Jarrett, and William's wife. Harriet Clisser was born Harriet Farrow on the 8th of April 1814 in East Wittering in County Sussex, England, the daughter of George Farrow and Jane Pollard. She had been married 3 times prior to meeting Griffin, with the 2 sons who accompanied her to Australia from her first marriage, to William Jarrett in October 1832 in Littlehampton. William was born in 1833 and George in 1838. Her husband, William Jarrett, died in May 1847 in County Mayo, Ireland. Harriet then married Thomas Crosbie in October 1847 at Cork in southwest Ireland. And then in February 1851, she married Mark Lewis Clisser in Dublin. Mrs. Clisser was described as a wealthy widow, possessing resources of several £100s. In accounts of Griffin's immigration to Australia, newspapers referred to Harriet as Mrs. Crosbie, a widow, although immigration records do list her name as Clisser. Thomas John Griffin and Harriet Clisser were married on the 29th of April 1857 in Essendon, Victoria. Griffin may have initially intended establishing himself as a publican in Melbourne, possibly using Harriet's funds, but at the annual meeting of justices for the granting of publicans' licences for the City of Melbourne on the 28th of April 1857, so the day before he married Harriet, Thomas John Griffin had his application refused for the Bird in Hand Hotel in Flinders Lane on account of the dilapidated state of the premises. After they were married, they went into business together, but Griffin soon squandered nearly all of her money. The couple argued, and a separation was the consequence. According to the social and legal conventions of the time, marriage virtually turned legal control of a woman's property permanently over to her husband. English law held that when a woman was married, she became, in a sense, her husband's property. This common law doctrine was known as coverture, and it allowed a married woman's legal identity to be subsumed in her husband's. The presumption was, though, in this law, that it was on the condition that the man continued to provide the sustenance of the woman. Griffin deserted his wife and he went to Tasmania, and he actually got persons there to circulate reports of his own death in New Zealand in an effort to avoid the requirement to support his wife. One report said that Harriet's fortune was considerably overrated, but whatever money she did have, it says that he spent that quite liberally before they separated. So apparently he told her that he was intending to go to New Zealand to make his fortune over there, and then he would send for her. But no word came from him. And then there was a cutting from a New Zealand paper. It was an obituary column, and the name of Thomas John Griffin was on the list of recently deceased. So Harriet, for all intents and purposes, thought that her husband had died, and from that time on called herself a widow, totally unaware that Mr. Griffin's demise was bogus. In Sydney in May 1858, Griffin turned up in Sydney and joined the New South Wales Police. He was initially taken into the constabulary office as a clerk. From late July 1858, newspaper reports began to be published regarding the discovery of the rich gold field on the Fitzroy River, 31 miles northwest of Rockhampton at Canoona. At the time, it was classed as the Northern District of New South Wales. Queensland hadn't been separated from New South Wales at that time. In late 1858, Griffin was appointed to Rockhampton as the acting sergeant. In February 1859, he was appointed Chief Constable at Rockhampton, with the additional responsibilities of Inspector of Slaughterhouses, Inspector of Weights and Measures, and Bailiff of the Court of Requests. In March 1859, Griffin was appointed as the Inspector of Distilleries for the district of Rockhampton, and in December 1859, the letters patent formally proclaimed the separation of the colony of Queensland from New South Wales. By this process, the employment of all colonial officers, both civil and military, within the territory of the colony of Queensland were transferred to the new colony. So in November 1860, Griffin was transferred as Chief Constable from Rockhampton to Brisbane. And it says the Chief Constable of Brisbane, Mr. Thomas Quirk, who's been in hot water almost ever since he's been here about one thing or another, has wisely effected an exchange with an officer of the same grade in the force at Rockhampton, and Mr. Thomas John Griffin has been appointed in his stead. Mr. Griffin was a long-time member of the Irish Constabulary Force and was a cornet in Her Majesty's Commission of the Turkish contingent in Crimea. In February 1861, he was appointed to the additional role of Ranger of Crown Lands for the Police District of Brisbane, and a year later he was appointed Acting Clerk of Petty Sessions in Brisbane, and on January 1863 he was formally appointed to the position. In Brisbane, Griffin made efforts to ingratiate himself with people of position and authority. He gained prominence in British society and became a regular attendant at Government House festivities. Throughout this period, Griffin consistently represented himself as a single man, and it was said that in Brisbane, Griffin paid great attention to a young society lady, a sister of a man who held a higher position in the ministry. And it was asserted that the minister assisted in advancing Griffin's career after Griffin alluded to a desire to marry the minister's sister, but professed a belief that he was unable to marry until he was working in a higher paid position. In October 1863, Griffin was appointed as the police magistrate for the district of Peak Downs, with the additional role of Commissioner for the Peak Downs goldfields, as well as Inspector of Police and Commissioner of Crown Lands, where his overbearing manner made him unpopular. Gold had been found in the Peak Downs region in November 1861, so by 1863 the goldfields held a considerable population. The local magistrate and landholder, Oscar Desage, described Griffin as an energetic man who soon after his arrival arrogated to himself a good deal more than even the full powers of his various appointments. Griffin was assisted in his official duties by the Clerk of Petty Sessions, William Cave, who Desage describes as a plodding but timid officer who could do little to check Griffin's overbearing will. During his 4 years residence at Clermont, which is the closest town to the Peak Downs goldfields, Griffin became widely known in the district. In general, he had a very suave and attractive manner, although there were aspects of his character that tended to have a polarising effect. To those that he considered to be socially inferior, Griffin tended to be overbearing and was by no means well liked. To his friends, he was usually courteous to a degree, but at times he was somewhat brusque. He was described as ostentatious and vain, with a fondness for display, as the dominant traits of Griffin's character. During his tenure at Clermont, Griffin was also known to be a gambler. He was a frequent visitor to a house in Clermont where heavy gambling was carried on in a room isolated from other parts of the house. During his time at Clermont, his wife in Melbourne then discovered that her husband was alive. Without support, Harriet Griffin had been having a difficult time. In September 1864, she was listed as a new insolvent, citing want of employment for herself or family and pressure of judgment creditors. Her liabilities were recorded at £28 against her assets, which were valued at £1. Harriet was living at Emerald Hill at the time and was recorded as a widow. At some stage after that, Harriet saw a newspaper article mentioning the name Thomas John Griffin, Gold Commissioner at Clermont in Queensland. She was struck by the similarity in names with that of her supposedly late husband, and her suspicions were aroused. Harriet Griffin consulted a lawyer who ascertained that no one of her husband's name had died at the time and place that had been represented to her. A letter was subsequently sent to Griffin in Clermont, and the end result was that he was compelled to make his wife a substantial quarterly allowance. Griffin continued to represent himself as a single man, to the extent of forming an intimacy with 22-year-old Elizabeth Otley, the daughter of Mrs. Elizabeth Otley, a widow living at Rocklands on the outskirts of Rockhampton. Griffin's relationship with the young woman developed to such an extent that the two became engaged. Mrs. Otley and her 2 young adult children were recent immigrants from England, having arrived at Rockhampton in May 1865. Elizabeth Mary Frances Otley was born in 1845 in India, the daughter of Major Thomas Henry Otley of the East India Company and his wife Elizabeth Rebecca Doe Bell. Elizabeth was an infant when she and her mother returned to England by May 1847, where her brother Osbert was born. In April 1857, Elizabeth's father died in Bombay, India. Mrs. Otley purchased 45 acres at Rocklands, around 4 miles south of Rockhampton. Griffin's frequent absences in Rockhampton threw a good deal of work and responsibility on the local bench of magistrates. In about April 1866, in his role as senior magistrate at Clermont, Oscar Desage wrote to the Colonial Secretary in Brisbane complaining about Griffin's conduct, accused him of blatant abuses of duty, and requested an inquiry into his behaviour. Desage detailed a number of issues, including interference with the local bench, misuse of troopers' time, and Griffin's interception of a letter critical of him that had been addressed to Desage. An inquiry was held in Brisbane by the Under-Secretary of the Civil Service, but owing to sickness and other causes, a number of witnesses were unable to attend. Griffin was acquitted of blame due to the want of evidence. After the exoneration, Desage claimed Griffin acted more independently than ever. His absences at Rockhampton became more frequent, and it was rumoured he was getting into debt. In August 1866, Griffin was appointed as the returning officer for the electoral district of Clermont after the resignation of that position of Oscar Desage. In July 1867, unsuccessful litigants in a court case at Clermont complained about the conduct of the police magistrate Thomas Griffin, in response to which the District Court Judge Innes recommended that they memorialise the government for Griffin's removal. In the Queensland Government Gazette of the 3rd of August 1867, details were published of a series of planned transfers of police magistrate positions, including the transfer of Griffin from Clermont to Toowoomba. About that time, though, local agitation had begun to build for Griffin's removal from Clermont, and the leading advocates for which were the local medical practitioner, Dr. Spiridion Candiotis, and S.W. Jacobson, a Copperfield storekeeper and postmaster of that township. In September 1867, Jacobson met with Charles Buzzacott, the co-owner and editor of the Clermont newspaper, the Peak Downs Telegram, seeking his advice. Jacobson informed Buzzacott that the conduct of the police magistrate had become intolerable and that a number of sufferers, including himself, were determined upon bringing about his removal. He asked Buzzacott about the best method of proceeding with that objective, to which the editor advised sending a temperately worded memorial to the government, Shortly afterwards, Jacobson and Dr. Candiotis met with Buzzacott in his office, where a requisition was drafted addressed to the Clermont Mayor, John Winter, to consider the desirability or otherwise of memorialising the government in favour of the removal of the police magistrate. The Mayor subsequently agreed to the meeting and a notification was published in the Peak Downs Telegram. A day or two later, it became known that Griffin was to be transferred from Clermont, but Dr. Candiotis decided to go ahead with the meeting in case the report of Griffin's transfer was untrue. The public meeting was chaired by the Mayor of Clermont, and during the meeting, Mr. Candiotis, who at one time had been a friend of Griffin, spoke in scathing terms of the police magistrate and attributed his appointment to Clermont as the action of an unscrupulous minister. 2 resolutions were proposed, both of which were eventually carried. The first resolution was that it is desirable for the welfare of the community that Thomas John Griffin should be removed from his position as police magistrate in consequence of the inefficient and unsatisfactory discharge of his magisterial duties. The second resolution declared Griffin was despotic, arbitrary and partial, and that he had lost confidence of the public. After the meeting, a petition with 20 signatures was forwarded to the Colonial Secretary calling for Griffin's removal from Clermont. Despite these efforts, however, the report of Griffin's imminent departure from Clermont proved to be correct, and he was transferred to Rockhampton as Assistant Gold Commissioner under the Gold Commissioner John Jardine. There was a farewell dinner to note Griffin's departure on the 4th of October 1867 in the new billiard room of the Leichhardt Hotel in Clermont. It was attended by 35 gentlemen representing the squatting, mining and commercial interests of Peak Down. Meals, toasts and speeches were made, and the chairman of the proceedings, the Mayor, John Winter, in a brief speech remarked, "All must be aware of the many good acts Mr. Griffin has done during his long residence in the district." During his speech, in response, Griffin expressed his appreciation of the way in which his name had been received this evening, which he regarded as proof that those present do not condorse the calumnies which had been recently uttered against me. Several of the subsequent speakers referred to the late contemptible attack upon Mr. Griffin and pointed out that many of the statements made by Dr. Candiotis were absolutely false and others were perversions of the truth. On the eve of Griffin's departure from Clermont, a gold escort consisting of Sergeant James Julian and 2 troopers left Clermont for Rockhampton with 2,806 ounces of gold. Gold escorts operated between the goldfield settlements and major towns, where gold was transported to a banking institution by authorised police officers and exchanged for cash, which was then escorted back to the bank branches or nearby goldfields. The Clermont escort arrived at their destination on the 17th of October 1867. Griffin had left Clermont soon after the gold escort and arrived at Rockhampton 2 days later, on the 9th of October. After his arrival in Rockhampton, Griffin was informed that a group of 6 Chinese miners had been making inquiries about money and gold they had given to Griffin 5 months previously to be sent by escort from Clermont to Rockhampton, of which Griffin had provided no satisfactory account. When the Chinese learnt that Griffin was in Rockhampton, they constantly worried him about the matter. Soon after arriving in Rockhampton, Griffin told Sergeant Julian he intended sending him back with the cash to be deposited in the Clermont branch of the Australian Joint Stock Bank. Griffin's actions in this regard were purely on his own initiative and without authoritative warrant. On the 25th of October, Julian received an order from Griffin to get money from the Rockhampton branch of the AGS Bank. The following morning, Saturday, October the 26th, Sergeant Julian and Trooper Patrick Cahill went to the bank, collected the cash in 10 canvas bags, which consisted of 4 packages, each containing £1,001 notes, 2 bundles of £5 notes amounting to £4,000, and £151 in gold, silver and copper coins, making a total of £8,151. Julian and Cahill then parted, arranging to meet up that afternoon at the Railway Hotel. Julian waited at the hotel past the pre-arranged time, but as Cahill failed to appear, he returned the money to the bank and rode out to the escort camp near a lagoon at Rocklands, 4 miles south of Rockhampton, where he reported Cahill's absence to Griffin. The camp used by the gold escort was located 400 yards from the residence of Mrs. Otley. The following morning, Sunday, October 27th, Griffin instructed Julian to go to the bank and retrieve the 10 canvas bags. Cahill had since returned to the camp, and both men followed Griffin's instructions. After they returned with the money, Griffin told them to be ready to start for Clermont that afternoon, telling them he would accompany them on the initial stage of the journey and camp for one night. Griffin, Julian and Cahill made a start at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and travelled as far as Stanwell, where they camped off the road. Julian laid the canvas bags on the ground under his blankets and slept upon them. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Cahill was sent to look for the horses. To Julian, Griffin's behaviour during Cahill's absence seemed odd. He seemed uneasy and appeared to be watching Julian. When Cahill returned, he and Julian began preparing the horses for the road. Griffin then decided that the horses needed to be reshod. He told them that he and Cahill would return to Rockhampton to have the shoeing done, while Julian was to remain at the campsite with the money until Griffin sent Trooper Power out to him. Julian took issue with that suggestion, not wishing to remain alone with so much cash. He offered as an alternative to wait at a nearby pastoral station, but that did not suit Griffin, and so all three men returned to the camp at Rocklands. Troopers Power and Gildear were at the Rocklands camp when they arrived. Power and Cahill were directed to take the horses to Rockhampton to be reshod, and Griffin went across to Mrs. Otley's residence, leaving Julian and Gildear at the camp. He returned during the afternoon and directed Gildear to go to Rockhampton to collect letters. While Gildear was preparing to depart, Griffin returned to Mrs. Otley's. Julian, not liking the look of things, told Gildear to remain in camp until he'd spoken to Griffin again. Sergeant Julian then went across to Mrs. Otley's to see Griffin and once again protested at being left alone with so much money. Griffin, in a state, returned to the camp with Julian, and Gildear then went to collect the letters. By this time, Griffin's behaviour had aroused Julian's suspicions and he remained on the alert. Later that afternoon, the three troopers returned to the camp from Rockhampton, and during the night, Julian once again kept careful guard over the money bags. At daylight on Tuesday, October 29th, Griffin instructed the men to be ready for a start after breakfast and then left for Mrs. Otley's place. At the camp during breakfast, the tea was found to have a queer, bitter taste. Julian said to the others that there was plenty of milk to drink and took the billy and poured the tea into the ground. As he did, he discovered a white powder at the bottom of the billy. He did not mention this to his companions at the time, with the incident only becoming meaningful in retrospect. When Griffin returned, the party and their pack horses made another start. Griffin told them that instead of going by the road, they would cut across about 5 miles through swampy, scrubby country. Griffin led the way, but kept looking back at the troopers as if he was expecting something to happen. As they were approaching the small community of Gracemere, Griffin stopped their progress and told them he'd left a small parcel of gold behind at the clubhouse in Rockhampton, which had come down by the last escort from Clermont by mistake. He ordered Julian and the troopers back to the Rocklands camp and then rode off to Rockhampton. Instead of following instructions, Julian took the men and the horses into town and once again returned the money to the bank. In Rockhampton, Griffin saw Julian and the troopers returning from depositing the money at the bank and demanded an explanation, to which Sergeant Julian replied that he'd returned the money for safekeeping. Griffin was furious and suspended Julian on the spot. Julian surrendered his revolver and rifle to Power, whom Griffin had appointed in Julian's place. Griffin then went to see the bank manager Thomas Hall and told him he'd suspended Julian, claiming he'd been acting in a very strange manner and evidently did not want to go to Clermont. Hall said that as Trooper Power was new to the responsibility, he would only release half the money. Later that day, Griffin told the 6 Chinese men, through their intermediary, to meet him at the clubhouse on the following day and they would receive their money. Power took charge of £4,000 in £5 notes, £150 in silver and £1 in copper, which were bound up in 6 parcels and put into canvas bags. Power collected the money from the bank that afternoon and he and Cahill met Griffin at the Rocklands camp. Griffin told Power he would take care of the money for him so that the trooper could get a good night's sleep. He then took the parcel of cash to Mrs. Otley's. On the following day, the 30th of October, troopers Power and Cahill remained in the camp and Griffin went to town to meet the Chinese miners. He met them mid-morning at the clubhouse and handed over 6 rolls of £1 notes, totalling £252, each bound in a handwritten memorandum of the amounts due. While Griffin was in Rockhampton, the escort money was locked in the room that Griffin had been occupying on the veranda of Mrs. Otley's residence. The next morning, on the 31st of October, Griffin brought the parcel of cash that had been in his safekeeping to Power. It was bound with a different covering, which Griffin said was for more careful conveyance. Power implored the Assistant Gold Commissioner to remove the outside cover, saying, "As this is the first time I have been entrusted with such a serious responsibility, I would like to see the parcel in the same condition as I got it from the bank." Griffin replied, "Oh, I assure you it is all right. It has not been out of my possession since you gave it to me." Power said no more, but as he placed the parcel in the saddlebag, he felt a vacant space, as though one block of notes had been removed. Apprehensive and wishing to delay their departure, Power told Griffin that one of the horses had a sore back and was not fit to travel. Griffin directed Cahill to fetch the other horses. Power then communicated with Cahill in Gaelic, telling him not to bring the horses in, but drive them away to a greater distance. After some time, Cahill returned, saying he could not find the horses. Griffin then directed Power to take the horse with the sore back to town and get it replaced. While he was in Rockhampton, Power spoke to Mr. Hall at the bank, asking him to come out and make sure the parcel was all right. Hall told him that day was the annual balancing day at the bank and he would be out on the following morning. The bank manager Thomas Hall and his accountant Reginald Zouch travelled out to Rocklands Camp on the following morning, 1st of November. Hall complained to Griffin about the delay in making the start, which the Assistant Gold Commissioner explained by saying the horses had been lost. Hall asked Griffin to seal up the bags containing the money, but Griffin claimed that would be useless as the seals would break from the friction on horseback. During the conversation, Griffin assured Hall and Zouch that the money was quite safe. It had been locked in his room ever since Power brought it out. Later, Trooper Power asked Griffin to seal the bags, indicating he would not take charge of them otherwise. Griffin then sealed the bags, including the parcel from which the roll of notes had been taken. This action was particularly consequential. If Griffin's seals were intact on the arrival at Clermont, the notes would be found to be missing and suspicion would fall upon Griffin, as the parcel had been in his sole possession prior to the sealing of the bags. By insisting on Griffin resealing the packages, Power and Cahill must have thought they had done all that was necessary, never dreaming Griffin would resort to murder. After delays of nearly a week, the escort left the Rocklands camp on Friday the 1st of November 1867, taking the road via Westwood and Gainsford. The party was made up of the Assistant Gold Commissioner Griffin, Troopers Power and Cahill, and they were carrying £4,000 in notes and coin. Griffin's behaviour during the preceding week and his insistence on accompanying the escort part of the way was in stark contrast to the fact that during the 4 years of his tenure as Gold Commissioner at Clermont, Griffin travelled with the escort on only one occasion. Despite having indicated he would accompany the escort only as far as Gogango, Griffin continued to ride with them beyond that settlement. At about noon on the 4th of November, the party arrived at Ashcott's accommodation house at a place known as the Dam. A camp was established nearby and Griffin and the two troopers had lunch at Ashcroft's house and partook in some brandy. They remained at the location for the rest of the day. Early the next morning on the 5th of November, Griffin and the two troopers started for the crossing on the Mackenzie River, arriving there later that morning. They established a camp about 400 yards from Bedford's hotel and afterwards went to the hotel and had breakfast. Later that day, Griffin asked the publican, Alfred Bedford, if he had any laudanum, which he hadn't, and told the publican he intended to return to Rockhampton the following morning. Bedford indicated he would travel back to Rockhampton with Griffin. That night, the two troopers left the hotel at 8:30, having had a couple of bottles of beer. Griffin went from the hotel to the camp soon afterwards, taking with him a pint bottle of brandy. In part 2 of this episode, I'm going to outline what happened once the troopers fell asleep that night. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.